Good morning. The Lord be with you. Let's begin with prayer. God, we ask your guidance for our study today. May the thoughts that come to us, the meditation that we may be given from you, be pleasing to you. Help us to hear what you want us to hear, to understand what we need to understand for the sake of our service to your kingdom. In Christ's name, amen. Well, Psalms 68 and 69 both are somewhat longer than the usual Psalms that we have to deal with. And Psalm 68 in particular has been a problem for many commentators. In fact, let me read to you a section from Arthur Weiser's commentary on the Psalms. He says about this Psalm 68, in no other psalm are the various attempts at interpretation so diverse as in Psalm 68. It is not only that the severely corrupted text, that's the Hebrew text, and the willful and sometimes disconnected style offer great difficulties to the exposition of the psalm. The style in particular moves to and fro, alternating between forms of speech and those of narration, between description, prayer, and hymns, and between various verbal tenses, past tense, present tense, future tense. It has therefore been possible to advocate and dispute with equal emphasis both the historical interpretation of the psalm, which I take to mean its possible setting in the life of Israel as a song of victory, and then the possible eschatological interpretation, which seeks to understand the whole psalm as a document expressing human hopes for the future when the end of time will have come. And I have to say, I had never thought of that interpretation before. Weiser goes on to say these difficulties, moreover, are increased by the lack of a coherent and progressive train of thought and by a series of brief allusions, mostly couched in general terms, to incidents which evade any attempt on our part to relate them accurately to historical facts known to us, and finally by reminiscences of other Old Testament traditions, of which he cites several. Well, I want to counter that idea with one from Craig Broyle's commentary on the Psalms. Craig thinks there is a very consistent way to make sense of this psalm, and I have agreed with him. I think Broyle's suggestion is the right way to look at Psalm 68. And he says, the key to its interpretation lies in recognizing its original use as a liturgical text accompanying a ritual. That would be like something you might do in church, where you have a hymn that you do something when that hymn is being sung, like you might process into the sanctuary when that hymn is sung, or like on Palm Sunday. Many churches on Palm Sunday process with palm branches around the church and then enter the sanctuary singing hosannas to God, or some hymn that's written specifically recalling Christ's entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. So Broyles is arguing that this Psalm 68 could be understood as a song or hymn or text to be read and sung accompanying a ritual. In composition, therefore, it is governed primarily, he says, by ritual factors, not really by literary or thematic considerations. There are 4 allusions to the cherubim ark, that is the Ark of the Covenant over which the cherubim spread their wings. And he says we should probably imagine Psalm 68 sung alongside a ritual procession with the ark and the cherubim at its head. So in our imagination for how to read this psalm, we're going to read it as if we were observing a procession led by the Ark of the Covenant, a procession in our imagination, actually, from Mount Sinai in the Egyptian desert all the way through the wilderness wanderings of the people in the time after they were at Mount Sinai, after the Exodus and after the covenant with Moses at Mount Sinai, imagining them proceeding through the wilderness as was described in the book of Numbers, and then finally entering the promised land under Joshua, described in Joshua and Judges, and finally arriving at the temple in Jerusalem, which was built by Solomon. This psalm may, in fact, at least a portion of this psalm may have been very early, and possibly, Broyles thinks, comes from a time when the united monarchy still existed, which would be at least during the reign of Solomon. Well, we'll think about that, and we appreciate these two scholars giving us some idea of the difficulty of interpreting the psalm, but also an idea of how it might be interpreted in terms of a ritual text that accompanies a procession, both in imagination and in reality, in history, a procession that would have been reenacted in Jerusalem during the lifetime of the psalmist who wrote this psalm, at some date that we don't know. I think there's some indication in this psalm toward the end that it's actually after the exile, but we'll come back to that. So the psalm begins with an allusion to Numbers chapter 10, verse 35. Your commentary probably told you that, and I want to read that passage for us. Numbers, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers 10. There we go. Numbers chapter 10 and verse 35. This comes from a time when Israel was in the wilderness and they were not yet in the promised land. They are wandering in the wilderness and being led by the pillar of cloud and by the pillar of fire. And Numbers 10:35 says this: whenever the ark set out, this is the ark of the covenant, whenever the ark set out, Moses would say, "Arise, O Lord, let your enemies be scattered, and your foes flee before you." So this call for God to arise and to let God's enemies be scattered is exactly how this psalm begins. Let God rise up. I'm using the NRSV translation. Let God rise up. Let God's enemies be scattered. Let those who hate God flee before him. And then it mentions what are the consequences of God rising up. What happens when God rises up? Well, as smoke is driven away, so God's enemies melt like fire. They are driven away like smoke in the wind. They perish before God on the one hand, but on the other hand, when God rises up before his people and leads them, then the righteous are joyful and exult before God and are jubilant with joy. So the psalm starts out with this reference to Numbers 10:35, and which is the beginning of a procession. When God rises up to lead his people, and they follow, and good things happen. The enemies of God are put down, and the righteous are able to be joyful and exult in God and be thankful for God's deliverance of them. Then verse 4 begins a response to God arising, and that response is to sing praises to God and lift up a song on him who rides upon the clouds. Now you probably know from your commentary that this description of God as the one who rides upon the clouds is directly taken from the Canaanite religion, in which the god Baal, the storm god, was called the God who rides upon the clouds. Israel has appropriated that term for the Canaanite deity for Yahweh. We don't need Baal and his storm and his fertility rites. We need only Yahweh. Yahweh, in fact, is the one who is the God of the storm, who brings rain and lightning and thunder, and who is in control of the forces of nature and the forces of chaos. So sing praises to God as the one who rides upon the clouds. His name is Yahweh, not Baal. His name is Yahweh. This is who God is. So be exultant before him. And then we get this further description of God, I think in surprising terms. God as not the powerful warrior, not God as the one who gives strength to Israel's armies and its kings, but this is the God who is the father of orphans and the protector of widows, the God who gives the desolate a home to live in, and who leads out prisoners to prosperity, though the rebellious live still in a parched land. This is the God who is on the side of the poor and the oppressed, widows and orphans, homeless people. He gives them a place to dwell. And so we also have, I think, in verse 6, a reference to possibly the Exodus, where God leads out the prisoners, that is, the captive people of Israel who were captive in Egypt. He leads them out eventually to prosperity, while the rebellious, that is, the Egyptians, who pursued the Israelites and previously had captured them and made them slaves, they continue to live in a parched land. Whereas when God arises and leads his people out, he is going to provide for them in abundance. Verse 7, so, O God, when you went out, this is God arising up and going out before his people in procession. When you went out before your people, when you marched through the wilderness. This is the reference to the wilderness wandering of Israel, led by God in the Ark of the Covenant. When you did that, the earth quaked. And we had that in Egypt in Exodus chapter 20, the great earthquake when God's people were present in God's presence at Mount Sinai. When that heaven, far from a parched land where the rebellious live, in verse 6, when God is present, heaven pours down rain at the presence of God, the God of Sinai, at the presence of God, the God of Israel. Rain in abundance, O God. You showered abroad and restored your land, or your heritage, or your people. Heritage can mean any one of those things. To restored your land or heritage or people when it languished. So even though the rebellious Egyptians live in a dry and parched land, Israel's land is watered in abundance by God, the sky God, the storm God, not Baal, but Yahweh is his name, and he provides for his people and provides a place for his flock, verse 10, to dwell in. In your goodness, O God, you provided for the needy. So this is the God who shows his power by being on the side of the needy, the suffering, the weak, the homeless, those without families. God cares for those people in need and shows his power on their behalf to restore and strengthen his people. Then verse 11, the Lord gives the command, great is the company of those who bore the tidings. In other words, the Lord gives instruction to his people, perhaps in how to operate in this procession. God gives his command, and the company of those who bear the tidings, they say, and this is verse 12 then, what do they say, the company of those who bore the tidings? They say, the kings of the armies, they flee, they flee. The women divide the spoil at home, though they stay among the sheepfolds. So it's hard to know where the quote ends. In the Hebrew text, there's no quotation marks. One version of the end of this, where to put the quote marks, would just be around the phrase, the kings of the armies, they flee, they flee. In other words, as Israel is proceeding through the wilderness, following the Ark of the Covenant, which represents the presence of God, they have power over all their enemies. and the kings of the opposing nations around them flee in defeat at the presence of the God of Israel. So that the armies of the Israelites just go out and they see that God will conquer their foes ahead of them, while the women stay at home and divide the spoil of the armies that have been conquered, even though they stay among the sheepfolds. Yes, this is a division by gender of roles, implying that the men are in the armies, but they don't do anything because God is the one who conquers the peoples and causes the kings of the armies to flee, whereas the women are be able to stay at home, dividing up the spoil among the families of the people of Israel. This next verse is difficult to understand, and I think it would have been readily understood by the original readers. We wonder what it means when it says in verse 13, the wings of a dove covered with silver, its pinions with green gold. When the Almighty scattered kings there, snow fell on Zalman. One possible explanation is to take the clue from the snow that's mentioned in verse 14 and apply it back to verse 13. That is, the white wings of the dove represent the snow. The silver and the green gold are the snow upon the alpine mountains. That is, the green trees can be sticking up through the snow, and the sun is shining on them. So you get this glittering gold and silver effect on the snow on the mountains. At the time when God scattered the kings there, snow fell on Zalman, on the mountain on the east side of the Jordan River, as part of the wilderness wandering when Israel was coming up into the Promised Land from the east side of the Dead Sea and the Jordan River. There would have been a battle remembered here in which it snowed on the mountains at the time when God defeated the kings, and the people chant, the kings of the armies, they flee, they flee. So on that occasion in which the snow falls on Zalman, a mountain apparently on the east side of the Jordan River, the next thing the psalmist thinks about in that connection is Mount Bashan, which is also on the east side of the Jordan River, a mighty, many-peaked mountain, the enemy's mountain, a mountain on enemy land, and that this mountain of the enemy is pictured as envying and being jealous of Israel, of Jerusalem, of the Mount Zion on which Jerusalem is built. Why do you look with envy, O many-peaked mountain, at the mount that God has desired for his abode, where the Lord will reside forever? God didn't choose the mountain of any enemy of Israel. God chose the mountain of Israel, and he is the Lord, the God who rides upon the clouds, the Almighty, and he chose to make his dwelling on the mountain of Jerusalem, Israel's mountain, not the mountain of a foreign foe. So it's a claim that our mountain is better than your mountain because God resides here and not with you there. So the procession goes on with mighty chariotry, verse 17. Twice 10,000, thousands upon thousands. The Lord came from Sinai into his holy place. That sets the geography for us, all the way from Mount Sinai in the Egyptian desert, all the way through the wilderness, across the Jordan River, and into the Promised Land, and eventually, under the reign of David and Solomon, eventually down to God's holy place, the temple in Jerusalem. You ascended the high mount, that is the Mount Zion, leading captives, all the captives in your train, and receiving gifts from people, even from those who rebelled against the Lord who abides in Jerusalem. Blessed be the Lord. So again, we think about who God is. God is the one who led his people from Sinai through the wilderness, across the Jordan River into the Promised Land, and eventually established them in Jerusalem in the temple as God's holy place where he will reside forever. So all of this so far, the first 18 verses, has been about who God is and what God has done. Starting with verse 19, we get to the present. Blessed be the Lord who daily bears us up, not just our ancestors in the wilderness and in the crossing of the Jordan and in the building of the temple where God took up his residence, not just in the past, but now. Blessed be the Lord who daily bears us up now. God is our salvation, not just theirs, but ours. Our God is a God of salvation. And to God the Lord belongs escape from death. So the people here give thanks that God is their God who saves them from death, and who protects them as he dwells on Mount Zion. God will continue to shatter the heads of the enemies, verse 21. God says, I will bring my people back from Bashan. I will bring them back from the depths of the sea. So that they may exult in the defeat of their enemies. And the description there is one of, in verse 23, is one that is difficult to think about in terms of vengeance, of bathing your feet in the blood of your enemies. But that human way of describing the defeat of the enemies is common in the Psalms and in the ancient Near East, where you couldn't be rescued without also destroying your enemies. There is a note of vengeance and retribution there that's not helpful for us. But I wondered if this passage didn't refer here not so much to the Exodus, but to the return from Babylon, to the restoration of the people from Babylon after the Babylonian captivity in the 6th century, when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem and destroyed it, took the people into exile. Here God says, I will bring them back from foreign lands, back from the depths of the sea, so that they may exult in victory over their foes. Can't prove that, but it sounded like it might be a possible context for this psalm. So we now get in verse 24 a direct reference to the procession. And in fact, the writer says that people can see this. Your solemn processions are seen, O God, the processions led by this Ark of the Covenant, the procession of my God, the King, into the sanctuary. We've now gotten all the way from Mount Sinai, across the Jordan, into the Promised Land, and now the temple is built, and God the King, the great King, is entering his sanctuary, with the singers in front, and the musicians at the back, and the tambourine girls in the middle, and everyone is singing, Bless God in the great congregation, the Lord, O you who are Israel's fountain. This is the words of the song that the singers are singing. There is Benjamin, the least of them, that is the smallest of all the tribes, the youngest of the sons of Jacob. Here is Benjamin, the least of them, the princes of Judah coming in a body, as well as the princes of Zebulun and the princes of Naphtali. These are references to tribes from the south and the north, possibly pointing out, as Craig Broyles thought in his commentary, to a time of the united monarchy. But I think it could also be read as a future hope for the restoration of Israel. The rest of this psalm, again, I think we're in the present. We're calling on God to be mighty and powerful in verse 28, to rebuke the wild animals, symbolizing the enemy as animals that oppose Israel, trampling underfoot those who lust after tribute, scattering people who desire in war, who delight in war, and envisioning that tribute is being brought to God in Jerusalem, in the temple, from the Egyptians and the Ethiopians. So sing to God, the psalm concludes, O kingdoms of the earth. Everybody now, not just the Israelites in this procession are singing, but all the kingdoms of the earth are called to sing praises to God. and to sing praises to the God who is the rider in the heavens. That reference again to the Canaanite deity Baal as the storm god, which has now been appropriated by the Israelites to describe our God, Yahweh, the rider in the ancient heavens. He sends out his voice, his thunder, his lightning, his mighty voice. Ascribe power to God, whose majesty is over Israel, whose power is in the skies. Awesome is God in his sanctuary, the God of Israel. He gives power and strength to his people. So this hymn ends with an acclamation, a powerful acclamation of who God is and the power and might of God, that Israel might rest secure, knowing that God is with them in his sanctuary. Blessed be God. And so Psalm 68 ends with the probably clashing of the cymbals and the blaring of the trumpets to announce the presence of God in the sanctuary, the whole procession having been led into the sanctuary by the Ark of the Covenant, as people sing this song to accompany the procession. Well, that's almost our whole time on Psalm 68. I want to say a little bit, though, about Psalm 69. Psalm 69, very different from 68, is a psalm of an individual in deep difficulty. He immediately states his request in verse 1, save me. And he then describes his situation as being in deep waters, in deep mire where there's no foothold. He feels as if he's on the verge of death. He has been crying out to God so much that his throat is sore and his eyes are growing dim from waiting for God to act and deliver him from his enemies, who are then described in verse 4 and following. So many are these enemies who want to destroy him. And one of the things that these enemies are doing, as we have seen in other psalms, is accusing the psalmist falsely, of accusing him without cause. He has not done anything to deserve the attack of these enemies. He's being accused of having stolen something that he must now restore. And he says, God, you know my folly. You know the wrongs I have done. They're not hidden from you. I didn't do this, which I'm being accused of, because you know all the wrongs I do and my folly, and I wouldn't be appealing to you if I had done something for which these enemies are actually attacking me. God, you know all my sins, all my foolishness, and I have not done this thing which I am being accused of by my enemies. So then he says, do not let those who hope in you be put to shame because of me. He's trying to give God some reasons for acting on his behalf. And one of those reasons is other people will be harmed. Other people will be shamed or dishonored. Again, an honor-shame society, right? So other people will be shamed if I go down, if I am put to shame, if I am dishonored. And I don't want that to happen, God, and you don't want it to happen too. This is why you should help me. In fact, it's for your sake that I have borne reproach. Shame has covered my face, and I've become a stranger to my own family. So God, you should help me, because I've been on your side. I have defended you. I've had zeal for your house. I want it to be a good place. I don't want any idols there or anything to happen there that is not pleasing to you. So I have been a person of enthusiasm and zeal and hard work on behalf of your house, possibly suggesting or implementing reforms that other people have objected to. Think of Jesus cleansing the temple and being criticized by those who were running the temple money-changing operation. The insults of those who insult you have fallen on me. This is, as you may have noticed, this is a Christological psalm. This is a messianic psalm, and it's the Psalm 69 is the second most quoted psalm in the New Testament, because so many of the verses refer to Christ and his life and his suffering, particularly his suffering. And so the psalmist is expressing his own suffering and giving God reasons for helping him and for being sympathetic to him. He humbles his soul with fasting. He makes sackcloth a sign of his own repentance and penitence and humility before God, but all of that results in nothing but insults and criticism and jokes and drunkards' songs and gossip. Verses 10, 11, and 12. Despite his humbling himself before God, he's received nothing but criticism from other people. So it's to God alone that he turns in prayer. He refers to God's steadfast love in verse 13. He knows that if he receives God's steadfast love, his problem will be solved. So he asks God to rescue him again. And in verses 13 and 14 and 15, we hear about the mire and the floods and the deep waters all over again, a repetition of those same situations described metaphorically. We think it's metaphorical anyway. Jeremiah, though, was thrown down into a well in the miry pit with deep water, and that was to be taken literally, but apparently this is probably metaphorical. But it's life-threatening. Don't let the pit of death close over me, verse 15. Instead, God, answer me with your steadfast love, what we want God to do. And there's a series now of requests, repeated requests. Turn to me in your mercy. Do not hide your face from me. Make haste to answer me. Draw near to me. Redeem me. Set me free. A whole set of commands or requests to God that began in verse 1 with save me, O God. And these are all different ways, aren't they, that God could be described as saving the psalmist, turning to him in his steadfast love and mercy. God should help because God knows the dishonor and shame that the psalmist is receiving. You know the insults that have broken his heart, he says to God, how much I'm in despair. I tried to find help from other people, but nobody would help me. Verses 20 and 21. In fact, they gave me poison for food, and for my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink, a reminder of Christ on the cross getting the sponge with vinegar in it. So then we get a set of imprecations and how the psalmist thinks that God needs to defeat the enemies. Again, these are somewhat repugnant to most of us, but this is a culture in which there was no sense of afterlife, no sense in which God would judge the evil opponents after afterlife, the enemies, the idolaters, those who turned from God, and provide justice for God's people in the afterlife. You have to have it now in this life. So the psalmist thinks that God must do some of these things in verses 22 and following against his enemies, and to save the psalmist, who is, verse 29, lowly and in pain. O God, let your salvation protect me. And then he makes a series of promises at the end in which he promises to praise and thank God for God's deliverance. When all of the oppressed see it, they will be glad. Those who seek God, their hearts will revive. This is God further giving God motivation for why God should act to rescue the psalmist, because when he does, there will be this praise and thanksgiving and encouragement from other oppressed people who will see God rescuing this oppressed person, and so they in their oppression will know that God will revive them and strengthen them and deliver them from their oppression, because God is the God who hears the needy, verse 33, and does not despise those who are in bonds, who are in slavery, who are in oppression. So let the whole earth, as we ended the previous psalm, this again now appeals to all the earth. Let the whole earth, heaven and earth, praise God, the sea and everything that moves in them. For God will save his people. He will save Zion and rebuild the cities of Judah. That means this is after the exile, when Israel is due to come back to the land and rebuild the city and the temple. God will provide encouragement and help the people to rebuild, so that his servants may live there, and all who do love God's name will live in safety in the place where God dwells with his people. So two very different psalms. One, an individual psalm of request for deliverance from pain and suffering and dishonor, and expressed in the end in hope and praise to God. And the previous psalm, a psalm sung to a procession, is celebrating God's victory over all the powers of evil, all the powers that have opposed Israel, until God takes his place in the temple, where he is praised and glorified and honored and given thanks to by his people. All right, 2 difficult psalms. I believe next week we will probably try to do 3 psalms, because Psalm 70 is short, and Psalms 71 and 72 end Book 2 of the Psalter. So I'd rather not have Psalm 72 hang over into the next of the 3rd section of the book of the Psalter. But we may not get through all that either, so we'll see. Well, thank you for again being part of this study. God bless you. I hope you have a great week. Think about celebrating the presence of God with you, and if you're having any difficulty, call upon the Lord, who delivers the oppressed, as so often is expressed in these Psalms. His steadfast love endures forever. Thanks be to God.